Okay, so I want to welcome everyone for joining us today on Stylin Safely. This presentation is brought to you by Black Women for Wellness and the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment. So a little bit about Black Women for Wellness. We are a nonprofit organization located in Los Angeles. We've been around for 16, 17 years now, and we have a whole host of programming from nutrition, health and wellness, um, diabetes prevention, also programming around civic engagement, getting people out to vote, our environmental justice piece, which is what today's webinar sort of focuses on. It's our environmental justice piece. My name is Tenny Adomi. I am the Environmental Justice Program Coordinator, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. So a little bit about some history on why we're doing this. We've been doing some work around salon workers specifically, and also chemical safety and chemical safety regulation since about 2008. We've done a series of, I would say, surveys and focus groups with salon workers, with community advocates, really influential people within the community. And one of the things we noticed that there was really sort of this lack of education or knowledge around chemicals we use, really lack of knowledge around chemicals that, in terms of their safety or in terms of if they're harmful or not, or what is toxicity and these things. So we wanted to develop a course to really teach hair professionals or really anyone who is interested really more about chemicals and chemical exposure. So normally it's a full day workshop, but we've broken it down into 3 webinars, and this is the first of the series. I'm going to kind of just delve right in. So part 1 really focuses on chemicals and our health. So I wanted to kind of start out with a little bit of objectives of today, really being able to identify products found in the salon that contain chemicals or products found in ultimately our everyday lives, explaining why some chemicals may be harmful to workers' health and really what makes them harmful. A lot of times when we say the word chemicals, everyone just kind of assumes everything is bad. But, there's some good chemicals, bad chemicals, and so really trying to explain that today. Another thing we're going to be talking about is really how chemicals get into our body and really determining our exposure to them. And lastly, identifying health problems related to chemical exposure. So before I started, I wanted to do just a quick kind of brainstorming exercise. And I'm going to ask a question. I hope everyone can just type into the chat box for me really the answers or what they think are the answers. So the question is, what products in the salon or in our lives contain chemicals? So just type your answer in the chat box for me, and then we'll kind of go over that. Any comments from anyone? Okay, so I have one. I have makeup. Thank you. Yeah, so really essentially when we look at products in the salon or in our life that contain chemicals, it really can be anything, right? It can be our makeup, our shampoo, our hairspray, colorings, all these sort of things are products that are in our life that we use every day that do contain to some degree a chemical or two. In some cases, way, way more than that. Okay. So next I just wanted to talk about what the different forms chemicals can take. And this really can help people in the salon, anyone really be able to identify, when they have a chemical, what exactly it is. And so we know that chemicals take on different forms. And so some of the different forms are they can be a solid, in terms of your dust, your fibers. So when you're in the salon, you're sort of thinking, when you're looking around in your salon or in your home, things like talcum powder. So that would be sort of this, even though it's kind of fine, it's still this dust fiber powder form, and that would be identified as a solid. And then you can also have liquids. And so these are essentially things that flow like water. So your acetone, it can be pumped when things are pumped or sprayed, can be broken down into droplets. So like your hairspray. And when they're broken down into these small droplets, it can also be called mist. And then you have gases, which essentially float and move freely in the air. You can't see or smell it, but you can still inhale it with the air. So this is ultimately something like formaldehyde. Sometimes we can't see, you can't see or you can't smell, and then you are really impacted. And in a lot of cases, this is really a negative thing. That can really impact the health of someone in the salon or you as a consumer as well. And then we have vapors, and vapors are usually they're sort of like gases, and they float freely in the air, but they come from liquids which have evaporated into the air. So when you sort of think about your acetone liquid in this open bottle, you have your nail polish remover, and when it evaporates into the air, the result is acetone vapor. Um, and so kind of moving on into what exactly makes a chemical hazardous to our health. And this really can depend on a lot of things. So it can depend on the toxicity, the amount, the length of time that you are exposed to that chemical, the interaction, and then the different routes of exposure. So we're kind of going to break down a couple of these and explain them a little bit more in depth. So what exactly is toxicity? So toxicity really means the ability of a chemical to cause harm to your body. So some chemicals are harmful, some are deadly, but with some chemicals, a small amount can cause harm. So that makes them toxic. With some chemicals, a large amount really has no effect ultimately on your health, and that makes them relatively non-toxic. So essentially, that's really the difference when you break it down and if something is toxic or not. If it can be harmful to your health in smaller amounts, in any amount, it's toxic. If it really, at large amounts, has no um, impact to your health, then it is non-toxic. The next is concentration. So concentration is really the amount of the particular chemical. So when we're really talking about the amount in terms of in the amount in the air you breathe, the amount that gets on your skin, and the amount that you swallow. In chemistry, we kind of learned that concentration is like the strength of a chemical, but when we're talking about health and safety, we really refer to the amount that you're being exposed to. And so length of time. So really the reason length of time is really important is the longer you're exposed to something, especially if it's something, toxic, the more chemical that gets into and on your body. So for example, if you're going to be in the salon for about 6 hours, every day, specifically doing chemical processes, you're exposed to a chemical much longer than someone who's doing that service for only 2 or so hours a day. So ultimately, we're saying the more exposure you have to something, the more risk you have. And really, there are sort of these different people react to a chemical in a different way. So a lot of times when we're going out into the community and we're talking to people, they're like, well, I've used so-and-so for a long time and I've never gotten hurt. I've never gotten sick. I think we see that a lot if we think of like an example, sort of an extreme example, when we think of things like smoking. So, you will have people, there are lots of people who develop things like lung cancer or some other really adverse effects from smoking. But you'll have the people who say, well, I smoked 30 years and 30 plus years and nothing happened to me. Well, it ultimately depends on a whole host of things, a whole host of factors, really called your individual sensitivity as to why some people are more sensitive to different chemicals than other people. So the first is really heredity. So, we don't really know why, but some people seem to inherit a higher sensitivity to chemicals than other people. So really, it could ultimately be your genes, right? Your whole family could be really sensitive to a certain thing or a certain chemical. So next we have age. And really some chemicals can have more serious effects on the very young or the elderly. So when we look at things, for example, like lead, right? So lead poisoning. So when children are impacted or come into contact with lead poisoning, it really ultimately affects their IQ as they grow up later on. So really when we focus on things like that, we look at children being exposed. The next thing we have is pregnancy. Certain chemicals, pregnant women are more at risk. And so there are chemicals that can harm just the mother, and there are chemicals that can harm the mother, the fetus, or both. And use of alcohol and use of tobacco. So alcohol can increase the effects of toxic chemicals on your liver and other organs as well. And smoking causes harm to your lungs and really the ability to protect, really hinders the ability for your lungs to protect themselves against certain chemicals. And it can also increase the health effects of certain chemicals. And then your overall general health. We sort of know this in some different aspects. If you're an all-around generally healthy person, you may not be as impacted with certain chemicals as other people. But if you're already in poor health, then you could be negatively impacted by certain chemicals. And your gender. So when it comes down to even things like our reproductive system, different chemicals affect different genders in different ways. And then medication. So, we know that medication, when you're taking medication, you're not supposed to drink alcohol or do some of these other things, but certain chemicals also may interact with the drugs that you're taking for health reasons and can really cause some serious harm. Do we have any questions so far? Okay, great. So the next thing I wanted to really talk about or touch on is chemical interaction. And so chemical interaction really talks about the exposure to different chemicals and what that exposure can do or can produce an effect that's worse than either of them alone, right? So when we're looking at if you're smoking cigarettes, which can increase your risk of lung cancer, and then if you're exposed to asbestos fibers from old hair dryers, which can cause increased risk of lung cancer. Now, if you're smoking and you're being exposed to these asbestos fibers from old hair dryers, that can greatly increase your risk of lung cancer and more. And, while I was doing research for this webinar, I thought it was really, really interesting. I didn't know that they used to have asbestos fibers in old hair dryers. And so this is something that, if people are going to buy maybe secondhand stores to buy equipment for their salons, really making sure that they're buying equipment that wasn't made a long time ago and doesn't have, you know, um, chemicals or harmful things in them, especially as we know regulation and things have changed. So this is one that we get a lot in terms of people really wanting to know what exactly are the routes of exposure. And so, wanting to know, well, how do chemicals even get in my body? Like, how does that happen? And so, this can happen a number of ways. And so one of the main ways is really just breathing, right? So once you breathe a chemical into your lungs, it can stay there or it can be carried in your bloodstream to other parts of your body. And so this is how chemicals can really impact different organs in your body. Um, they don't just kind of hang out in your lung. They really are able, depending on their size, to move into other areas. And next we have skin and eye contact. So sometimes chemicals can harm our skin directly. So we know this in terms of chemical burns or irritation or rashes or dermatitis. And those are things that we can see, right away. One of the things we've seen while doing a lot of this, a lot of research that we've been working on in terms of looking at health effects and health risks of stylists is we've noticed that a lot of them said, yeah, I have gotten dermatitis, I've gotten chemical burns. We had heard horror stories of stylists not having fingerprints anymore because of how corrosive some of the chemicals that they were using really were. And so in terms of eye irritation was actually another one of the things that we found and saw a lot in terms of how chemicals can really impact your eyes and cause serious burn or irritation, and causing really risk of kind of splashes and issues like that. And then swallowing. So most people don't necessarily swallow harmful chemicals on purpose, but accidental things do occur. So for example, if you're in an area where you're working with different chemicals and then are picking up, then you're like eating or drinking in that area. So one of the things we recommend is if you're working with certain things and certain chemicals and you doing certain processes, that really your foods and your drinks should not be in your work area, right? Your food and your drinks should be in a completely different area when you're done. When you're done with whatever process you're doing, you wash your hands, then you go into another area to ultimately handle any of those processes, or another area to eat your food or drink your drink. And also, one of the things we've seen it when we've gone into salons or even different workplaces is that people will have this sort of clear liquid, but there won't be maybe a label or sort of this distinction of what this liquid is. And, you may know what it is, but if someone comes into your salon or workspace and doesn't and assumes they're something like water, um, that can cause a lot of problems later on and down the line. So really making sure if you're going to have things like clear liquids in your workspace to label them, let people know what they are, or put them in a colored bottle or something, just to really distinguish them from water. So I wanted to do a quick brainstorming exercise. So I want everyone to really be involved in this one. And so kind of knowing all the things we've learned a little bit so far and just seeing how we can put what we've learned kind of into a little bit of practice. And so in front of you and you're on your screen, you're going to see it's just two examples. Um, so it's the process in terms of like we've got shampoo and then we've got perms, and then how the different routes and how they can ultimately get into our body in these different routes. So kind of take the time to look at this and really determine, well, how can breathing, what step in terms of doing shampoo can I be impacted by breathing in terms of, and then moving on to skin, eye, and swallowing. So for example, I can start off with shampoo with breathing. When you're first opening up a bottle of shampoo in terms of the fumes or anything that comes out of that. So that would be somewhere where you would be impacted through shampooing and breathing. So I'm going to give about a couple minutes for everyone to kind of go through and work on that a little bit, and then we're going to talk about it in a minute or two. Okay, so I'm going to give about a minute or so left. Okay, great. So moving on. So here, this would ultimately be kind of the different routes of exposure. So these are the answers to the brainstorming question. So in terms of shampoos and breathing, you could be exposed to the vapors when opening up the bottle or wrapping the hair in solution. Actually, this is switched back and forth. So the top row is for perms and the bottom row is for shampoo. Sorry about that. Yeah. So in terms of wrapping your hair in the solution, the wrapping hair in the solution in terms of perms, you could be impacted by your skin when applying or rinsing. So this does ultimately, if you're wearing gloves, you could kind of prevent this exposure route, and you're making sure you're wearing the right kind of gloves. In terms of eye exposure, splashing or touching your eyes, so really kind of avoiding touching your eyes when working with different processes. And then lastly, swallowing. If you have the chemical solutions on your hands, if you have shampoo on your hands or perm on your hands, and then you're touching your mouth or you're eating or drinking, this could really impact your exposure. So, is there a safe level of chemical exposure? This is something that we get all the time in terms of like, well, is there a safe level? If I use a little bit of something, am I okay? And so one of the things we really say is that really it's safest to keep exposure of any toxic chemical as low as possible, right? So, but because some chemicals are more toxic than others, it's really important to keep worker exposure specifically very, very low. And so, when we talk about, laws and regulations in terms of looking at chemical exposure and chemical limits. Here in California, we have Cal OSHA, and Cal OSHA sets levels of limits to certain chemicals, and these are called permissible exposure limits. And so they're really levels that we're not supposed to go over. If you're going over these levels, they can cause harm to you. So, for example, if you have, a PL and you're supposed to stay below 10 parts per million or something, and you go over, you're really ultimately being exposed to this chemical at levels that are very harmful to your health. Yeah, so it's the maximum amount you can be exposed to at work. And so there PELs for about 100 or so, several hundred chemicals, but a lot of these chemicals aren't chemicals that are actually being used in the salon. So that's unfortunate for us. And there are thousands of chemicals out there. So when we talk about, really knowing safe levels for chemicals, we really do not know safe levels for a lot of chemicals that we really should know the levels for. And in terms of cosmetic products, so cosmetic products ultimately currently right now are not regulated. This will be discussed a little bit in the second webinar, but I can touch on it a little bit here. So right now there is no governing body that regulates the cosmetics that we use in terms of safety, being able to pull things off the shelf. So when we look at things like the Brazilian blowout, different organizations knew that the Brazilian blowouts were containing really high levels of formaldehyde. But because governmental agencies, there's no governmental agency, for example, like the FDA, that can really pull these things off the shelf. So what we saw in that case were really different community-based organizations, governmental entities telling people, these are the products that are bad. These are the brands that have high levels of formaldehyde to avoid, but not necessarily having the power to pull these off the shelf, but just really telling consumers and stylists to stay away from these products. And so really how to tell if you are being exposed to something. So one of the ways is not necessarily looking, one of the ways is using your nose, right? So if you smell a chemical, you are probably breathing it in and it's getting in your body. But really remember that not all chemicals with odors are toxic. So there are some chemicals that may have some really strong odors and can still be harmless. On the other side is that some chemicals that are very toxic to your health, that are very, very toxic, have no odor at all. So really not being able to smell them, you're kind of going around your daily work, but still breathing these in. So really not relying on smell to warn you. And a lot of these days, things are kind of masked with fragrances. So you're, smelling the fragrance and it may smell like lemon or mint or something like that. But there could be other toxic products in there that don't necessarily have a strong odor. And the next is taste. If you are breathing in or swallowing a chemical, it may leave a taste in your mouth. And, not all chemicals that leave a taste are toxic, and some toxic chemicals have no taste. So really not relying also on taste, not relying on smell and taste to be your really key markers of if something is toxic or not. And particles. So, if you're being exposed to a certain chemical, you may cough up things like mucus, and it could have certain particles in it. You could blow your nose and see particles. For example, if you're walking through a really dusty space, and then you kind of walk out of that space and you're sneezing and you're blowing your nose, and you can really see some of that dust in what you're blowing out of your nose. So thinking of different work processes, like if you're a nail salon worker and you are doing like acrylic nails, or using one of those tools that really kind of grinds the nails and causes all these different particles to float out. If you're not wearing the proper protective equipment, you could be really exposed to these kind of dust particles. And when you sneeze or blow your nose, you can really see that on your tissue, or even just really see that in the air. And then surfaces. So looking down at kind of your workspace and surface. So if you see dust and powder and mist collecting on surfaces, they ultimately came from the air, and you were most likely exposed to them. So really looking out on your table, your chairs, shelves, and even your own clothes to really see if you are being exposed to certain chemicals or certain particles. And then symptoms. really, at times, your body will tell you if you are being exposed to something. So you may experience symptoms which may have been caused by chemicals. So this can include tears in your eyes, a burning feeling in your throat, um, so burning feeling in your throat or skin or nose, and dizziness and headaches. And you'll also kind of know too, especially if you're in a salon setting or workplace setting, if your coworkers are also having similar symptoms at the same time, it may definitely mean that you're all being exposed to a certain toxic chemical. And so if these symptoms really worsen over time and they get worse at the end of your work shift, um, and or if they are better once you leave the workplace, they may be then you may be exposed to something at work. So really, the best way to know if you are exposed to something is doing some air quality testing, and so my profession or study is industrial hygiene, which is workplace health and safety, but in the technical side of really going out there and doing like air monitoring um, to really test different workplaces. And you can definitely get in touch with us at Black Women for Wellness if you're interested in having your salon air quality tested or having someone come in and really look at the ventilation system and see if there's something that could be done to better increase air quality in your salon or workspace. So I wanted to do another quick brainstorming exercise. Um, and so this brainstorming exercise ultimately is, I'll switch it over to the next, just answering this question, and then we'll have a little brief discussion and then kind of talk into more about health problems that can be caused by chemicals. So put your answer in the chat box for me. You can send it to the group as a whole, or you can just send it to me. But what are some health problems that chemicals might cause? I'm going to give you guys about a minute or so. Okay, we've got something from Octavian. I know you all answered the question, and I'm trying to click on it and see your answers, and it is not letting me. Let me see if I can do this again. Okay. Thank you, Octavia, Angeletta, and Connie for your answers. Okay. So some health problems chemicals might cause really include asthma, rashes, sore throat, include allergies or tiredness, dermatitis, birth defects, and even cancer. So there's some chemicals that can really cause um, a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And one of the things that we get a lot of questions are, well, if I'm exposed to something for a short amount of time or a long amount of time, what does that mean? When you're reading some of these like labels and it starts talking about like acute exposure or chronic exposure. So we're going to kind of go over and define what exactly that is. So acute versus chronic. Um, so acute exposure is really something that happens immediately or soon after you're exposed to a chemical. So kind of an acute reaction. So it could be something minor from if you breathe in ammonia, you can get some throat irritation right away. Or it could be something major, right? So you know, splashing acetone in your eye or really getting like relaxer vapor passing out from relaxer chemical vapor. That's something that's acute but major. Chronic. So this can take up to some years to show up, right? So, and it could be caused by regular exposure of harmful chemicals for a long period of time. So we're thinking of things like if you're inhaling hairspray for many years of working in the salon, you can develop things like asthma. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit as we're kind of winding down in the webinar about some specific health effects and what they can be caused by. So looking at things like irritants. So irritants cause irritation, usually produce immediate reaction. So you feel it in your eyes, your nose, your throat, your lungs. This is something that we saw a lot when we were doing our surveys. And so we saw kind of the main symptoms of eye irritation. So you're going to have burning and watering of your eye, itchiness and redness. In terms of nose or throat irritation, you're going to have like a runny nose, a scratchy throat, also burning and irritation. And lung irritation. So the main symptoms are going to be difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, and a cough. So what are some products ultimately in the shop that can cause all these types of irritations? So you're looking at your permanent wave solutions, your chemical hair relaxers, acrylic nail products, hairsprays can really irritate eyes, nose, and throat. And just, those are just a few of the products. And you may know more products that ultimately can impact irritation and health effects in that way. Um, so some other health effects include allergies. So an allergy is a reaction when you're overly sensitive to a particular chemical. And so allergies can develop over time, or they can be allergies that you kind of see right away. So You may have a reaction every time you use a certain chemical or a certain product, no matter how small of an amount it is. So for one of the examples in terms of allergies can be sort of the Brazilian blowout. Again, another that can be used for many examples. But really looking at things like formaldehyde, right? Formaldehyde can really cause an allergy. And so chemicals that cause allergies are called allergens. So, you may or you may not be allergic to a chemical the first time you use it. Allergies usually take time to develop over certain years or a certain number of times. So people can be using something, and be perfectly fine, and then maybe the 10th time they use it, all of a sudden they're allergic to it. They're really developing over time, and it could be different for different people. So some of the symptoms of allergies include, your stuffy nose, tearing in the eyes, sneezing, wheezing, coughing, itchy skin rash. There's some more serious allergic reactions in terms of asthma. So, and then you would be needing things like an inhaler later on down the line. The next thing that we've seen a lot is dermatitis. So dermatitis is an inflammation of the skin. So think like a rash. A lot of the similar terms that you hear are contact dermatitis or allergic dermatitis. These are all forms of dermatitis. And so the symptoms of that can include flaking, dryness, itchiness, burning. I was reading a study and it said ultimately close to 60 to 70% of stylists will get contact dermatitis, um, in their lifetime while working. And so, how do you get this? It's really irritation on your skin by like shampoos, different chemicals and different things, your conditioners that you're using, just be washing your hands a lot. And so really, when you're looking at shampoos, what do shampoos do to our hair? They really strip out all the dirt and all the oils. That's really what's happening to your hands every time that you're doing a shampoo with your hands. It's stripping all the oils and everything from your hands. And then lastly, the central nervous system. And so what makes up our central nervous system? Our central nervous system is our brain, our spinal cord, our nerves, and that ultimately is what makes our central nervous system. And some chemicals can impact our central nervous system by causing headaches, dizziness, drowsiness, restlessness, restlessness, and lack of coordination. These really impact our central nervous system. And kind of something similar is like when you drink too much alcohol, sort of the similar effects when chemicals impact your central nervous system. And these are most likely caused by breathing in vapors from certain chemicals. Um, So, for example, things that can affect our central nervous system, like your acetone, your acetate, toluene, and these are things found in some nail products. And so that's why it's really important to, when you're shopping for like nail polish, to make sure things are toxic trio free. Now it's toxic 5. I think there's toxic 5 free. So toxic trio would be dibutyl phthalate, toluene, and I believe formaldehyde. So making sure those are not in your nail polish, and making sure toluene isn't in some of the different products that you're using. And then cancer. So really cancer is the growth and spread of abnormal cells in the body. It's really actually a growth of it's actually a group of similar diseases, not just one specific disease. And you can get cancer on the job if you're exposed to certain chemical substances under specific conditions. And things that cause cancer are called carcinogens. So specific carcinogens include things like cigarette smoke, benzene, and asbestos. So cancer is not very common, even though I think we all know someone who's been impacted with a certain type of cancer. But there are some studies that have shown that cosmetologists as a group, do have somewhat more cancer than the general population, though still rare. So, when we're thinking of these things in terms of like higher rates of cancer, we still really don't know the reasons. And so that's why there's really a need for more continuous study, specifically looking at the products that we use, and also the people who are using these products the most and really being impacted. So, for example, methylene chloride was used in some hairsprays until it was banned in about 1989, and that has been shown to be a carcinogen. So some other things that have been used in sort of cosmetics and the beauty industry that have been known to be carcinogens are like coal tar. So coal tar was used in hair dyes, and coal tar and coal tar products have been linked to things like cancer of the bladder. But, still a majority of chemicals that we are using have not been linked to cancer as of now, that we know of right now. And health effects of reproductive harm. So really looking at kind of our reproductive system and chemicals that can have the ability to affect your ability to have children. And so there has been some risk in looking at chemicals in hair salons, bleaching products, permanent wave solutions. Some studies have shown that cosmetologists are exposed to these different chemicals at large amounts, have had more miscarriages than other women. In some of the research that we're looking at in Black-owned salons, we found high rates of uterine fibroids, miscarriages, difficulty conceiving, and these are some things that are linked through some studies in terms of looking at exposure in salons to reproductive health outcomes. And so this is also something that really ultimately needs to be studied more and looked at, especially when we're looking at the impact of these chemicals to workers, many of whom are in that sort of reproductive age range. So that is my presentation for today. Oh my gosh, right on time. Next week's webinar is going to focus specifically more on chemicals in the salon and really talking more about safer alternatives to products that are currently used, where you can find safer alternatives, how to read and understand labels on beauty products. So this is really good also for consumers who can get label fatigue in terms of looking at labels and not really understanding what exactly does that mean. And we'll be doing a little bit more interactive case studies of how to spot these sort of chemicals in our everyday lives and how to minimize our exposure. If you guys have any questions about today's session, any questions, any comments, I know for some reason I cannot see the little comment section. So I would really, really love if Everyone could just send me an email at tenny@bwwla.org, .com. Did I put .org? Yeah, bwwla.com. If you guys could just send me an email, your thoughts of the webinar. This is a continuous series that we're trying to do both for stylists, community activists, and consumers. So I would really love the feedback and what you wanted more of, what you really liked, what you didn't like. You can be completely honest with me. But yeah, feel free to call us at our office if you have any other questions, 323-290-5955. And please make sure to visit us at bwwla.org. There will be a quick pre-test right after this. I think it's about 5 questions, very easy. If you all could just take the time to fill that out for me, that would be completely awesome. We also have some handouts that I can share and some fact sheets that we are currently working on. And it will be releasing our report around salon workers and health, specifically in South LA, specifically looking at Black salon workers. And we will be releasing that report very, very soon. It's in the printers. It's all ready to go. So we look forward to sharing that information with all of you. So thank you again, everyone, for joining me today. And I really hope you got something out of it. Okay, bye-bye.